Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Medill School TV studio here on the Evanston campus in Evanston, Illinois. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this very special celebration of the work of our colleague Penny Abernathy, who's been so influential and impactful in local news in the U.S. We're going to have a conversation with Penny in just a few minutes, but before we do that, I'd like to introduce the Dean of the Medill School, Charles Whitaker, who has a few words that he'd like to say.
Thank you, Tim, so much. Penny, I remember when Tim came to me and said you were leaving USC and there was a possibility that you might consider bringing your many talents to Northwestern and Medill, and I felt like we had won the lottery. I could not believe that you would actually be willing to come and bring your tremendous, and as Tim said, impactful research to Medill. I knew that that was just what we needed to take our local news initiative to the next level, and you have done that in more ways than I could ever have imagined. The local news initiative is doing wonderfully, but I can say you actually were the engine that really helped this go, and we are so appreciative for all the work that you have done. It's been a pleasure working with you. You've been an inspiration to me and to those of us who are working in this arena. And we just want to present you with a small token of our appreciation. It says for distinguished service in local news, and yours indeed has been distinguished service in local news to the industry, to the academy, and to those of us who care so much about this work. Thank you so much, and we wish you all the best in this next phase of your life journey.
Well, thank you so much, Charles. I would say it takes a community to do something like this, and I have felt every day the support that has come from this great community at Medill. So thank you for making the opportunity for me to come here, and thank you for all that you and all the countless other people at Medill have done.
It's been our pleasure.
Thank you, Charles. I'd now like to introduce the new director of our State of Local News project, Zach Metzger, and Zach has a few words that he'd like to say, and then we'll get on with the conversation. Zach?
I just want to extend, on behalf of myself and on behalf of the entire rest of the Medill research team, such our heartfelt thanks for everything that you have done. You have been a tireless supporter, and you've been so generous with your time, with your mentorship, and with your guidance. And you really helped to grow this team into something really special. So thank you so much on behalf of all of us for everything you've done.
Well, let me just point out that Zach is not a newcomer to this.
That's right.
He has
That's
been
right.
involved in this work for over 4 years.
Right.
And I could not have done it without Zach. So I'm thrilled that Zach is carrying on this important work.
Absolutely. All right, thank you. Well,
Thank you.
with that, let's talk some local news. Okay. This afternoon for this conversation. And Penny, I just wanted to add to what's been said already. I'm so grateful that you joined us 3.5 years ago to be part of this project. I'm so thrilled we were able to lure you from the University of North Carolina, and I knew you had other opportunities at other universities, but I'm so grateful that you chose Medill.
Well, Tim, I have to say too, you're one of the world's best recruiters. You you softened me up for 3 years before as you began forming the local news initiative, and thank you for including me from almost the very beginning in all the workshops and other conferences that you did. So it made it an easy transition.
Well, it's been a great partnership, and I've really enjoyed it. And I just wanted to say to you and to everyone that our intention is to continue the important work that you started and to grow it. And I wanted to let you know that we're going to continue with the same rigor and care that you have contributed to this research for all these years.
I'm sure you will, and that's why I'm glad it's here at Medill.
Yeah,
so.
well, thank you. So I've now seen firsthand, having worked with you, the incredible impact this research has. I just checked yesterday. There have now been 4,121 news articles referencing the State of Local News Project since we published it in November, which is
Right.
incredible.
Yeah.
All the major national news organizations, an audience reach of 269 million people. If that's not impact, I don't know what is. And then every week we receive, as you know, because you get many of these, we receive requests for the database from scholars, journalists, philanthropists, and industry leaders, and we make it widely available. So we're grateful for those requests. And the reports raised awareness about the crisis in local news that's resulted in public policy proposals around the country. The state of New York just passed a bill over the weekend. The Illinois Senate passed a bill at the end of last week. So the public policy efforts are really gaining steam, and I don't think much of that would have happened, but not for your work and not for this research. And then it's also led to the Press Forward campaign in many ways, I think. A $500 million effort led by the MacArthur Foundation and the Knight Foundation to improve the sustainability of local news over the long term. And speaking of philanthropists, Penny, I'd like to read this note to you from our friends at the Knight Foundation, which has so generously supported this project. Dear Penny, as you embark on this new chapter, Knight Foundation expresses our deepest gratitude for your years of dedication and service to journalism and education. Your passion for local news and your commitment to preserving its vital role in our communities have inspired all of us. The State of Local News Project is the embodiment of research informing action. Your research and insights have not only shed light on the challenges facing the industry, but also have provided invaluable guidance for those of us seeking to improve it. Your contributions have made a lasting impact, and your legacy will continue to shape the future of journalism for generations to come. Thank you for everything, Penny. We wish you all the happiness and fulfillment that this new chapter has to offer. You will be greatly missed, but your influence will live on. Your friends at the Knight Foundation. So,
well, and this couldn't have been possible without support
Right.
from financial support from the
Absolutely.
Knight Foundation too.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, and our friends Ashley Zahn and Jim Brady, I think, are on Zoom this afternoon. So special thanks to them. And on a personal level, I just want to thank you for all you've done to support me and the Local News Initiative. For the past 3 years, I have such great respect for you and your expertise. And I was telling somebody the other day, I literally learn something new every time I talk to you. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with me.
I'm not sure you should share what you learn each time, Tim.
Well, no, I do cherish it. So let's now share that wisdom with those of us who've joined us this afternoon for this conversation. And please, by the way, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will try to get to those as we move on with the conversation. So Penny, you've served as a senior vice president at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and you were a publisher at Harvard Business Review. After those prestigious roles, you were appointed Knight Chair at the University of North Carolina, where you turned your attention to local news. But the question is, after working at major national publications like that, why did you make the pivot to local news?
Two reasons. You know, one of the things that was, excuse me, very fortunate for me was I became a Knight Chair after more than 3 decades in this profession. Mm-hmm. First as a journalist and then as a business executive, and it really hit me that this is a vast country. Mm-hmm. You can look at the stats. It's 3.8 million square miles, stretches all the way from Hawaii up to Maine, down into the Caribbean. 330 million residents, 3,100 counties, and you know, we have depended from the very beginning on a vibrant press to cover those issues. Yep. And I think that, so for me, being at the top, the pinnacle of a national news organizations, even international, you understood that you're only as good at the top as you are at the foundation.
Right, exactly.
So for journalistically, it struck me, I had been fortunate to be at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Harvard Business Review as they really geared up to make the transition into the digital age.
Right.
So I came here wanting to do that, to help local news, understanding that as a professor, I had a unique ability to take those years, and as night chairs do, take those years of professional experience and apply them to research and to teaching, so that you're not only researching, but in your best situation, serving the industry and also bringing students there.
Right, right. Well, so when you started that work, it's been what, 15 plus years?
15 plus years.
Did you have the feeling then that the nation was headed toward a full-blown crisis in local news? And if so, what were the trends that you saw that led you to that belief? In other words, how did we get here?
Actually, I became a night chair about 2 months before the Great Crash and the Great Recession of 2008. So I came in thinking it was just a matter of helping local news organizations make the transition. The Great Recession changed all that. I like to say that, you know, when Wall Street caught a cold, Main Street caught pneumonia. And all the advertisers, local advertisers who had been supporting local news operations, most especially community newspapers, were suddenly decimated. And that meant that advertising fell just tremendously. The other thing that happened was that the cost of buying a newspaper fell from 13 times annual earnings to about 3 times annual earnings. So, and many chains of the traditional chains we had grown up with had taken on huge debt, and they were kind of like the people who had houses where their mortgages were underwater. And into that market came the private equity hedge fund groups, buying them out of bankruptcy. And the problem is, if you are buying a newspaper at only 3 times earnings, you can go in and manage it just like you would a widget factory. You go in, you cut costs, and at the end of 3 to 5 years, you just say, I either continue to harvest it, or I sell it and flip it and start the process all over again. So, you know, we had an economic assault. We had a transition going on anyway to digital, and into that market you overlay that with the emergence of a new type of media baron, the private equity and hedge funds, who they didn't have the traditional journalism ethics you and I grew up with, that said that journalism is a civic mission, and there is a commitment to a community to provide the information we need to make this a democracy. So I think it was 3 things that just kind of came together in the 2 or 3 years following 2008, after I became a night chair. So it was a matter of not just shifting to developing new business models, but also figuring out who had been hit the worst.
Now, one of the things you're famous for is the phrase news deserts. Can you talk a little bit about how you landed on that phrase and how that became, I mean, it's now widely used. Every conference I go to, news deserts is constantly a topic.
Well, I'd like to take credit for having coined the phrase. I actually did some research, and I think it was in a Chicago newspaper article that it was first used in about 2011. We talk about food deserts, we talk about media deserts, we talk about news deserts. So I always find it, I've always liked the term desert, because things grow in a desert. It's just that they don't grow as abundantly as they do in a more temperate zone. So, you know, people have said, why didn't you say news vacuum? Well, there's news. It's just not necessarily the quality and the quantity of what you would find elsewhere. So I've been real careful to say, I define a news desert as a community, either rural, urban, or suburban, with very limited access. And I want to put that on, very limited access to the kind of comprehensive, incredible news that feeds democracy and nurtures community. And you can have lack of access because there is no the type of news you need. You can have access because you don't have the technology to get to acquire it, or you can't afford to pay for the technology or the subscription to acquire it. But it's vitally important, I think, for our democracy and for our sense of belonging to have local news.
Yeah, absolutely, and I want to get back to that point in a second. Before I do, though, as you've chronicled so well in your research at UNC and now at Medill for the past 3 years, there are now more than 200 counties. that have no source of local news, no newspaper, no digital site, no ethnic media, no public radio. There are 1,562 counties with only one local news source. Of those, 228 counties are on Medill's watch list, which we just started last year. In other words, they're at high risk of becoming news deserts in the near future. So let's get back to the question that you just raised. What are the implications for communities and for our democracy, especially in an election year, when local news goes away?
Well, I'm very worried that just as we are a politically divided and economically divided community, we're turning into a nation that's also journalistically divided. You tend to have an abundance of some sort of journalism, both national, state, and local, in more affluent areas, and the ones that are economically struggling and the traditionally underserved communities have a real deficit of that. And that has huge implications for our democracy. And there's also been recent research that has shown that it also is contributing to the polarization here, because into this desert seeps all sorts of information that isn't necessarily credible or comprehensive at all.
Right. Yeah. No. And I'm concerned with AI that we're going to see even more misinformation and disinformation. In this upcoming election. So I'm going to ask you to put on your prognostication hat for a second. You follow local news more closely than just about anyone. Is it your assessment that the local news industry has bottomed, or do you think that this crisis is going to deepen a bit more before maybe it turns?
I wish I could answer the glass was half full or half empty. And every time I think it's bottomed, there's yet another assault. And every time someone predicts this is going to be the catastrophic year, something has come in to keep it from that. I think the thing that bothers me is that my research on development of business models shows that if you want to establish a sustainable business model, either for-profit or nonprofit, or some hybrid, it pays to be it's largely determined by the demographics of the community, the ownership structure, and whether you have enough capital to invest to innovate. So if you're an affluent or rapidly growing community, you usually have people who are either willing to pay to subscribe, or you have advertisers who want to reach them. Local ownership is always better because you're locally accountable. And then, but the real key becomes, can you generate enough revenue or have enough set aside that you can keep innovating, or investing to innovate? Because as you know, innovation is never a smooth ride up. It is that you try things, things don't work, you have to adjust the strategy, and that takes time and money.
Right. Well, and you've written in reports for us and previously that one of the problems with this era is we have the news haves and the news have-nots, right? And if you live in one of those news have-nots areas, not only are you not getting a lot of local news and information, but the ability to innovate and to be an entrepreneur is more limited.
Right. And it's even if we say we want businesses to be sustainable, that means you've got the business environment is constantly changing. And all the work that has been done on creative destruction, and that's really what we're living through, shows that there's no safe bet, right? You can be in good shape one year and 5 years out down the road be in a very different place. So you've got to stay on your toes and have that money to invest.
Yeah, no, for sure. So do you have thoughts, and this is a very complex problem, but do you have thoughts on how we can fix this? Is there a model for local news that you see that gives you hope? Do you have any specific examples of local news outlets that you think are getting it right?
Well, I think the thing I've said from the beginning, people would say, when are you going to discover the business model that's going to save us? And my answer from day one has been, there's not going to be one business model as there was in the past. There are going to be many. And I'm very inspired by all the publishers out there of legacy newspapers. There are about 3,000 that are independently owned, and by and large, they have been very innovative, much more innovative in terms of trying things, because they're close to the audience. They figure out what the audience wants. So I think that it's going to be a combination of for-profit we shouldn't give up on the for-profit model. It is working. It is working in many hundreds of markets right now, and it will work, depending on, as I said, demographics, ownership, and ability to invest. We need the nonprofit, and I am thrilled for the Press Forward initiative
for sure.
going forward. And I think we're going to need public policy of some sort to address those areas where you don't have the demographics, the ownership structure, or the investment opportunity, the investment capital that you need.
Right. I just wanted to remind everyone again, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will venture to get to those as we continue the conversation. And also to those, we also have folks live here in the studio with us. So also please be thinking about questions if you have ones that you'd like to ask as well. So many people these days are touting, speaking of solutions, nonprofit digital news startups as being our future. And they argue these news organizations can operate independently from big private equity controlled chains, which is true, that they're unburdened from quarterly profit pressures, which is true, and that they can be supported by philanthropy and community members. But you're not completely sold on that as being the solution.
I was going to say, as I said before, I think we're going to need a mix of that. And as you know, we track not only newspapers, we track digital sites, we track ethnic media, and we track public broadcasting. You know, one of the things, unfortunately, we found with many of the digital sites is they don't make it. There's only about, of the ones that we track now, we have about 560, and less than 40% of them are older than 5 years old. Fewer than 40%. So it's very hard to make it through that first 5 years. And I think that's one of the things we all of us, vastly underestimated. Digital sites often need scale. And if you're starting something from scratch, it's much harder to build an audience than it is, even if you have a legacy operation where the audience is declining or plateaued, you can at least build off something. Whereas starting it is an immensely time-consuming and personal commitment from people that are there. The other thing that I worry about philosophically on digital sites, well, let me say economically, I worry about the fact that I think you've got to be very focused on digital sites. Most digital sites, I think only a little bit more than 10% of the local and state news sites we track have more than 10 people on staff. So you've got to say what is my area of expertise and what am I going to really do. So that leaves a lot that's not being covered, because we've lost 60% of journalists since 2005. On the newspaper side, and not been able to fill that void with what we've added on the digital side. And the second thing that worries me is there was a lot of research done back in the 70s that showed that local news operations could be immensely important in helping communities solve problems. And they did it in three ways. One was, what are the stories they're covering? What kind of coverage, intensive coverage, do they continue to give it? But third, and most importantly, what are the editorials they write afterwards to help with the solutions? So often with the nonprofit charters, you're limited in what you can endorse. You're certainly limited in terms of candidates. And that is one of the things I notice right now, is that we've lost that vetting function that editorial departments at newspapers used to do for us, for some of the lesser down ticket offices on both the state and the local levels that are not being done anymore.
Well, two words: George Santos. Happened in part because of a lack of vetting with news organizations in New York. For sure. And you know what, the other point that you've made often on digital news sites is that they're concentrated on the coasts. The Acela corridor on the East Coast, California and the Silicon Valley, in particular on the West Coast. But in the middle of the country, we really haven't seen that growth in digital.
Well, and here's the other problem, you know, that we don't think about a lot of times, is broadband is very limited.
Oh, good point. Yep.
From all of that. So, you know, one of my favorite comments came from the founder of Carolina Public Press in the mountains of North Carolina. She evolved from a very local site into a very statewide investigative site. And she said she went to sleep every night worrying about whether the story that she had written had been read by the people most affected by it. And I think whether it had gotten across that last mile of technology into the hands of people that were there. And I think that's a legitimate thing we need to think about with the infrastructure bill right now. You know, what will fill if we get broadband into these areas that are lacking? What is going to fill that? What's going to fill the broadband service, the streaming that goes into that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I mean, you can build a great digital news site, but if nobody can access it, you know, that's a problem. So let's talk about public policy some more. Do you think public policy could play a major role in addressing the crisis now? So there are 14 states that have either passed legislation or are considering legislation to help local news. There's federal legislation pending in Congress. I don't think anybody thinks that's probably going to pass at least this calendar year. What role do you think public policy can play in addressing this solution, and should the public be concerned about the independence of journalism if government is helping to support it?
Well, I think one of the things we have to first need to state is that if you look at the U.S. and compare it to other technologically savvy, technologically advanced, let me say, Western-styled democracies, we contribute about that much to our public broadcasting effort. So when I look at democracies in Europe, when I look at a Canada, I look at an Australia, they actually have good, strong regional public broadcasting. We have invested in PBS mainly through entertainment, and then we depend on NPR to pick up the slack from that. And there's just no way.
And a fraction of its funding is from
exactly.
the government.
A very, very small fraction. They depend on nonprofit contributions to do that. So, I mean, I think first we need to say, okay, others have made it work without the undue influence on that. But I think that the other thing we need to acknowledge too is that our founders believed so strongly that we needed some kind of public support for local news. One of the very first pieces of legislation passed in 1792 by the first Congress was a postal subsidy for newspapers. And it's an indirect subsidy. And I think we need to, what I'm so encouraged about is both at the national level and at the state level, and to a degree in some local communities, we're finding people thinking about indirect ways to support it. Tax subsidies for hiring reporters,
which was the New York
bill. Exactly. Subsidies for businesses, tax subsidies for businesses that advertise with local news organizations, and then, you know, various other things, subsidies for people who subscribe. The interesting thing is Canada has had something which was both a subsidy for subscribers, a subsidy for, I think, advertising, and a subsidy for reporters. And they found that especially the subsidy for reporters, even the smallest news organizations, benefited, said that their bottom line had increased by 10%. And 10% is exactly what you need. I'm haunted by a comment made to me by a publisher whose grandfather had won a Pulitzer Public Service on a very small weekly back in 1953 for taking on the Ku Klux Klan. And it was a life and death situation for him for a number of years, so he was very committed to doing it. It took 2 years to finally get the Klan under control in that southern community. But he said to me, the difference between operating at a profit margin of 15 to 20% and operating at a 5 to 10% is I have to self-censor. I have to worry every time I get ready to print a story, can I afford the legal bills that will come from this? And so, I mean, getting it up into 10% profit margin is the cushion that reliable news organizations rely on to be able to afford the libel costs, to be able to go after freedom of information request and pay the money that you need to get those public records.
Right. No, and you make a good point about public policy that is consumer choice, or that is independent, and it's not the government picking winners and losers. But it's a way to provide indirect support for local news organizations, and if someone wants to subscribe, it's their choice, and if they do, then they get a bit of a tax break for doing that.
Exactly.
So I think that's an interesting way to do it. Can I put you on the spot with a question? And this has been in the news. There's legislation pending in California that would require big tech, so primarily Google and Meta and the big tech platforms, to basically reimburse local news organizations for use of that content. It's been a hugely controversial issue. Google announced on Friday that it was going to pull local news off its platform in California while this legislation was pending. Do you have thoughts on that? You know, Canada, there was an agreement in Canada. Google's paying $100 million in Canadian dollars to support local news. What do you think of that, and where do you think that might be headed?
Well, look, there's no doubt that the large tech companies have siphoned off, research has shown over and over again, but around 75% of the digital dollars that are in any market. So that means you have startups, you have broadcast, you have newspapers, you have any legacy media, as well as the startups competing for what I call the digital scraps. And that's not enough to sustain vibrant local news at the local level. I guess the thing that worries me most about taking that route is that the large tech firms have big lobbyists that earn a lot of money for keeping things exactly as they are. So those kind of things, just like lawsuits, tend to take a long time to work through. The second thing that concerns me is that while they have damaged most news organizations, what people tend to look at what tends to travel, what tends to hit the algorithms, are the national news. So I really worry about how much of that really trickles down to the small news organizations.
Right, oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Right, so I mean, I think that if you're trying to save local news, what are you trying to save, right? I mean, of the 6,000 newspapers we have today, I think I'd say about 5,700 are what I would call small dailies and weeklies.
Right.
Not the metros, and certainly not the national newspapers, which I think I'll have to be shown that they will not benefit more than the smaller ones, because I just don't know how you divvy it up in a way that's meaningful for the smaller ones.
Yeah, you're right. It gets complicated fast, really fast. So at least in part because of this local news desert research, major foundations are stepping up. The MacArthur Foundation announced last September a coalition of more than 20 foundations. I think that number is now up to 57, I heard this week, have formed this Press Forward consortium, a campaign to inject what's going to be well north of half $500 million into local news over the next 5 years. MacArthur's continuing to add partners, continuing to raise money for this. That initiative may grow to $1 billion here before too long. What impact do you see Press Forward having on the local news situation?
Well, I think it can have, it has two benefits. One is symbolic. We have needed for a long time someone to step forward and say, this is vitally important for democracy. So, and to bring others along. You need something, you need the heft of a MacArthur, you need the heft of a Knight to say this is vitally important to democracy and to the welfare of any country as well as a community going forward. So I think symbolically it's hugely symbolic. And I also look at it as stage 2, you know, it's 2.0, right? Hopefully it engenders 3.0, 4.0, because you need to bring a lot more people into that. And I think that, I mean, my hope for this is that in 2.0, we can get beyond just the digital startups, but to also look broadly at where, and that to me is, I think, what's been so outstanding about the numerous foundations that have generously supported this research. On the surface it says, why would I want to just support pure research, where pure research tells you where it helps you target the approach.
Right.
And I hope that this research can be used to target it effectively for communities that are in danger of losing legacy organizations, communities that are going to have to make a transition from one form to another, from all of that. So I think that it has been, it begins to open up possibilities, I think Press Forward does. Now, the problem is, if you look at newspapers, they have lost around $40 billion a year in revenue, and $1 billion over 5 years.
Wow.
Is a small drop. But as again I said, symbolically, and it can begin to start, you need momentum, and
Right,
that's
absolutely.
momentum.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are massive losses. And you know, this could be a bridge
Yes,
for a lot of local news
exactly,
organizations
exactly.
while they figure out a new model
Yeah.
to get forward. So I think that's encouraging.
Yeah, and I like the fact too that there's a notion on looking at what communities have been underserved and are
Yes.
underserved now,
Yes.
right? And
for
I
sure.
think that because that gets us away from the Acela corridor and the,
Right,
the West
yep.
Coast dominance of those digital outlets, and gets you thinking about, if you can't reach somebody digitally, what are the numerous ways we can get the news to
Right.
people? How can we innovate to do it
Right.
logically?
Right. So we have about 8-10 minutes left. I've got a couple more questions, but again, please feel free. Those of you who are here in the studio, please feel free to jump in with questions as well. So as I mentioned earlier, Medill's going to be continuing the State of Local News report after you step away. And in fact, local news research is kind of booming nationally. Some of us were just at a local news researchers conference a few weeks ago, and the room was packed. I think it was like a record attendance. Many of those folks are probably on the Zoom as we speak. A number of major universities are now researching different aspects of the local news situation. So the State of Local News project is a major undertaking, a big project. I don't have to tell you that. What other aspects of local news would you like to see us or others researching?
Well, let me just say, I'm just so heartened by the number of young scholars, the
Yeah.
next generation of scholars who really feel even more passionately than I do about this. When I first became night chair, and I showed up at a couple of local news conferences at AEJMC and other places, and I was kind of thought like I was maybe the youngest person in the room. So we had a bunch of deans who in the 70s, 80s, and 90s kind of made this important, and so it has been great to see over the last 10 years the numbers that have. And I did a recent article for a journal, and I said there are really 3 areas that I think that we could see. One, Medill is going to look at the whole issue around ghost newspapers, those that this coming up here. I think we need to do it.
Can you define a ghost newspaper?
Well, it's interesting. I initially defined a ghost newspaper as a paper that had lost more than 3/4 of its staff. We now have located in the last year or so quite a few newspapers with no one on staff.
I know, yeah.
And I'm hoping that'll be rectified or at least called out in a way that is even more complicated than what we do here to figure it all out. But I mean, I think the ghost newspapers, I think the watch list, continuing to develop the watch list, because I think that can help the Press Forward initiative figure out how to target things.
Yeah.
So I think, and I know both of those are top of your agenda going forward. I'm also very heartened by the number of universities that have stepped forward to say, and League of Women Voters organizations in various states who have said, we are going to do our own State of Local News in Oregon or New York. And I mean, those are really important because we can only provide a national look.
Yeah.
We do go down to the county level in all of the 50 states, but you know, there's still data, and there's no substitute for on the ground kind of a notion of that. And I think that, you know, I would hope the other thing that is also very heartening are all the universities that are trying to figure out how they can use students. And I mean, I guess for me, as a professor and an educator, one of the most encouraging things for me was I would link projects with local news papers, and the number of students who had never considered a job in local news,
Right.
who then, instead of dreaming of saying, I've got to get to NBC or I've got to get to the New York Times as quickly as possible, started understanding there's just there's no greater feeling than what you can provide as a local journalist in that.
Yeah, you see the impact that you have on real people's lives every day.
Right, yeah. And you know the people you're writing about. It's not like you drop into town and you're gone.
Right. No, for sure. And we've talked about this too. You know, we've tracked loss of outlets. I think tracking loss of coverage, local news coverage, if we can get our arms around that, I think would be very informative, and I think would also help foundations and others that are working on this problem. And then I also wonder what comes in behind news deserts in news desert communities, and kind of with disinformation and misinformation and that sort of thing. So a lot to research for sure. Well, in the few minutes we have left, any questions from the audience here, or any questions out in Zoom land from any of you? No? Okay. Well, Penny, I want to give you the last word here. So when you look back at all the work you've done on local news over your time at UNC and now at Medill, how would you assess the impact that you've had during that time on the industry, on academia, on public policy, on philanthropy, on public understanding of the crisis? How would you assess your impact?
Boy. I don't think about those things. So let me just say, what I have been most inspired by. I started out being inspired by the publishers I saw and the editors I saw trying their dead level best, often without anybody recognizing it.
Right.
And that's what motivated me for basically from 2008 till about 2016, when I published the first report. Now, I had done the book Saving Community Journalism 3 years before, and that told me that there was hope there, but that the 2016 really. When I did that, it was called The Rise of a New Media Baron and the Emerging Threat of News Deserts. Right. And I honestly, like most researchers, I felt like a tree fell in the forest and maybe two people heard it. Fortunately, a couple of journalists who were business reporters heard it, picked up on it. And what was interesting is each time a new report was published, first journalists came on board by 2018. And then by 20, what was most encouraging were the number of scholars outside of communication, those in political science, those in history, those in sociology, those in economics, those in business, who were saying this is a critical issue for democracy, for capitalism, for our society. And I think, to me, what I would say to any researcher is it's very hard to look back and see what your impact is. It's also very hard sometimes to get up in the morning and do it again when you feel like nobody's listening. Right. But in fact, continuing to do that and providing information into where there is none is vitally important in solving this.
Right.
And that's why I'm very grateful to the foundations that have supported this research through thick and thin, because it would have been much easier to say I'm going to support experimentation or this, that, and the other. But this kind of research is really important, and I'm just so inspired by the young generation that wants to take it in lots of new and different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me ask you a personal question before we go. So you're taking a step back from the State of Local News project after all these years. What lies ahead now?
Well,
is it a book? Is it consulting? Is it writing? Is it some combination?
Well, there is a book I have been wanting to do for at least 6 years, and that book is about what I call the homesteaders. I feel really lucky to have gone into this profession at the point I did. What's been always interesting to me, when I was in journalism school, less than 20% were women. Within 20 years, more than half were women. Today, as you know, in most communication schools, it's about 80%. And I think there is a very different, we see lots of books on trailblazers. But I think what I owe so much to are the women who came just 2 or 3 or 4 years ahead of me, who said, I'm going to make this a profession. Because I think you do different things, just as homesteaders are very different, just as Daniel Boone is very different from somebody who went out to Kansas and put down roots and did it. I want to try to explore that, because I think that's part of a bookend for me that needs to be written and done. And I want to get to these homesteaders before they forget how important they were, because I think that we often overlook. We focus on the trailblazer, but it's really the homesteader. And I think that's an important thing to think about too, as we think about sustainability in news organizations. Innovation is important, but innovation that leads to sustainability is very critical too.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to get. So what else? Playing with a dog? How else are you going to spend your time?
I haven't really thought about it before. I mean, I was really lucky with many of the positions that I had before becoming a night chair, where I got to travel the world. And again, I feel really lucky to have traveled the world in the 90s and the aughts. It's a very different world now, and I feel very lucky to have been in Hong Kong when I was, to have been in Berlin when I was, to have been in Beijing when I was, to have been in St. Petersburg and Moscow when I was. So I think it's there's a part of me too that I've been lucky to. One of the things that, being night chair, I made it a point to say I was going to talk to a press association in every one of the 48 contiguous states.
Wow!
And
did you make it?
Yes, I have made. I've been to all 48 contiguous states. So there's. So part of it is just being able to appreciate where it is, and then decide what else you want to do too for all of that. And I'm not going away. I care very much about local news. I'm always available to those that have inspired me to offer advice, even if they're not paying for it, and it's worth exactly what they're getting from all of that, Tim. And of course, I will be rooting from the sidelines for you, Zach, and the team to take this in new and really wonderful directions that even I can't predict, and you can't either, right? At this point.
Absolutely. Right. Well, we will do our best to uphold the tradition.
I'm sure you will.
That you have started, and we're so grateful that your husband Harry could be with us.
Me too.
On this special day today, and it sounds like he needs to keep his suitcase packed.
Well, perhaps, and I could not have done it without him too. We celebrated 50 years of marriage recently, and
congratulations.
And so he has been a partner from almost the first day I met him at a newspaper that was just started in a small town in North Carolina. So we've managed to navigate that and career changes and everything else, and still 50 years later, and two adult sons and a wonderful granddaughter. So it's that is life is a sum of all of that, and so it's nice to have a personal and professional life that has worked out.
Yeah, absolutely, and I hope you have a good balance of both.
I do too.
Moving forward, and so again, I want to thank all of you so much for being part of this celebration of Penny's career today. I want to thank everybody who's in the studio joining us today as well. Thank you so much. And Penny, I think we're going to give you a standing ovation for all that you've done for us. Thanks
for you.
All right. Thank you. All right.